For 72 hours, the skies over Iran had been quiet. No cruise missiles tracking toward coastal targets, no strike aircraft penetrating the interior, no explosions lighting up radar installations or command bunkers. 72 hours of silence after 2 straight weeks of nightly operations that had systematically dismantled Iranian air defenses, communications networks, and ballistic missile storage facilities. Iranian state media declared the campaign over. Military analysts inside Tehran assessed that American operational tempo had reached its limit. The regime began messaging to its population that the worst had passed and that Iran had successfully weathered the storm. And then CENTCOM launched one final attack. And what that final attack targeted tells you everything about why the silence was never a pause. It was preparation. This is War Brief. And what you're about to hear is the operational breakdown of the strike that Iran did not see coming, the target set that changed the strategic calculation of this entire conflict, and why the 72 hours of quiet before the attack were not a sign that the campaign was winding down. They were a sign that the intelligence picture was being finalized for the most consequential strike package of the war. Let's start with what Iran was seeing during those 72 hours of operational silence, because understanding why the regime believed the strikes were over requires understanding what the previous 2 weeks had conditioned Iranian leadership to expect. The pattern had been consistent. Nightly strikes, cruise missiles launched from naval vessels in the Persian Gulf, strike aircraft penetrating from multiple vectors, targets hit across the coastal regions and extending into the interior, battle damage assessments conducted. And then the next night, another package. The tempo was relentless. Iranian air defense operators went to sleep, not knowing whether they would wake up to radar warnings of inbound threats. Communications officers monitored encrypted channels, expecting orders to relocate equipment before it got targeted. Ballistic missile crews moved launchers between concealment positions, trying to stay ahead of American targeting cycles. And then the strikes stopped. Not gradually, abruptly. One night, there were explosions across multiple provinces. The next night, nothing. The night after that, nothing. 72 hours of silence. No CENTCOM statements about successful operations. No reports of aircraft launching from carrier decks. No missile contrails visible from the coast. From the perspective of Iranian military leadership, the most logical explanation was that the campaign had achieved its objectives, and American operational planners were shifting focus elsewhere or waiting for diplomatic channels to produce results before committing to another phase of strikes. That assessment was wrong, but it was not unreasonable given the information available to Iranian intelligence at the time. What Iranian intelligence did not know, could not know, was that the 72 hours of silence were being used to finalize targeting data on a facility that required more preparation, more precise intelligence, and more operational coordination than anything that had been struck in the previous 2 weeks. The target was the Fordow fuel enrichment plant, not the surface buildings, not the administrative facilities, the underground centrifuge halls buried deep beneath a mountain near the city of Qom, the facility that represents the core of Iran's uranium enrichment capability and the component of the nuclear program that has been the subject of international concern, diplomatic negotiation, and military contingency planning for over a decade. Fordow is not a typical military target. It was engineered specifically to survive airstrikes. The centrifuge halls are located beneath hundreds of feet of rock and reinforced concrete. Multiple layers of hardening designed to absorb the impact of conventional munitions. The entrances are protected by blast doors thick enough to withstand direct hits from standard penetrating weapons. The ventilation systems are designed with redundancy to prevent a single strike from rendering the facility non-operational. Iranian engineers built Fordow with the explicit understanding that any adversary attempting to neutralize Iran's enrichment capability would eventually have to target it, and the facility needed to be hardened to the point where targeting it would be operationally complex enough to deter the attempt. The complexity is not just engineering, it is geometry. Striking a surface target requires knowing where the target is and delivering a weapon to those coordinates. Striking an underground target requires knowing not just the surface coordinates, but the depth, the internal layout, the structural reinforcement, and the precise location within the facility where a detonation would produce maximum effect. That level of targeting detail requires intelligence that goes beyond satellite imagery. It requires penetration of the facility, either physically or electronically, to map the internal geometry in enough detail that weapons can be programmed to reach the specific chambers where the centrifuges are operating. CENTCOM spent the 72 hours of operational silence finalizing that intelligence picture, verifying that the internal layout matched the assessments that had been built over months of collection, confirming that the structural analysis was accurate enough to guide bunker buster weapons to the depth required, and coordinating with the platforms and the weapon systems capable of executing a strike against a target, this hardened. The intelligence gathering process for a target like Fordow is extensive and multi-layered. Human intelligence sources provide information about construction details, operational procedures, and security protocols, signals, Intelligence intercepts communications between facility personnel and central command to understand shift rotations, maintenance schedules, and periods of peak operational activity. Geospatial intelligence combines satellite imagery with seismic data to build three-dimensional models of the underground structure. And all of that information gets fused into a targeting package that tells strike planners exactly where to aim, how deep the weapons need to penetrate, and what kind of munitions are required to reach the critical components buried at the facility's core. The attack came on the fourth night, not with cruise missiles, not with fighter-launched precision bombs, with B-2 Spirit stealth bombers carrying GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, the largest bunker buster in the American arsenal, 30,000 pounds, designed specifically to penetrate hardened underground facilities buried at depths that smaller weapons cannot reach. The GBU-57 is not a standard weapon that gets used on routine targets. It exists for one category of installation: deeply buried facilities that cannot be destroyed by anything else in the conventional inventory. The B-2 Spirit is the only aircraft in the world capable of carrying the GBU-57. The weapon is too large for the internal weapons bay of any other bomber or fighter aircraft. And the B-2 itself is designed for exactly this kind of mission: long-range penetration of contested airspace, stealth characteristics that make detection almost impossible, even for advanced radar systems, precision navigation that allows weapons delivery with accuracy measured in single-digit meters. The combination of platform and weapon creates a capability that exists nowhere else in global military inventories. The bombers launched from an undisclosed location, and the flight profile kept them outside Iranian radar coverage until the final approach. Stealth characteristics made detection almost impossible, even for radar systems that were still operational after 2 weeks of suppression strikes. By the time Iranian air defense operators realized inbound contacts were tracking toward Qom, the weapons were already in terminal guidance phase, and there was nothing left to do except watch the impacts happen. The GBU-57s hit within seconds of each other, multiple impacts, targeting different points of entry based on the internal geometry intelligence that had been finalized during the 72-hour pause. The weapons did not detonate on the surface. They penetrated through rock, through concrete, down to the depth where the centrifuge halls are located. The delayed action fuses allowed each weapon to punch through the layers of hardening before detonation, and then they exploded deep inside the mountain at the precise locations where maximum damage to enrichment infrastructure would occur. The explosions were not visible from the surface in the way that strikes on coastal infrastructure had been visible in previous operations. What was visible were the secondary effects: dust clouds ejected from ventilation shafts, ground displacement in areas where the internal structure of the facility collapsed under the force of the detonations, seismic signatures detected by monitoring stations hundreds of miles away, consistent with large underground explosions in confined spaces. And in the hours that followed, thermal imaging showed heat plumes rising from the mountain, indicating fires burning deep underground in spaces that were supposed to be sealed and protected. Iranian state media went silent on the Fordow strike for over 12 hours. No immediate claims of successful air defense engagement, no statements minimizing damage, just silence. And when statements finally came, they were carefully worded. Acknowledgement that an attack had occurred, claims that defensive measures had been activated, but no specifics about the centrifuge halls, no confirmation that enrichment operations were continuing, no imagery released showing undamaged equipment or operational facilities. The silence told the story that the official statements would not. Fordow had been hit, and the damage was significant enough that the regime could not credibly claim the facility was still operational without producing evidence that would contradict what satellite imagery was already showing to intelligence agencies monitoring the aftermath. The strategic implications of the Fordow strike are layered and extend far beyond the immediate destruction of centrifuge capacity. At the most direct level, the strikes removed a significant portion of Iran's ability to enrich uranium to the levels required for either civilian nuclear energy programs or weapons development. Centrifuges are precision devices. They operate at incredibly high rotational speeds to separate uranium isotopes based on tiny differences in atomic mass. They cannot be quickly replaced. The specialized equipment required to manufacture them is subject to international export controls specifically designed to prevent proliferation. Iran has domestic production capability, but replacing the centrifuges destroyed at Fordow will take months at minimum and potentially years, depending on how much of the underground infrastructure was damaged beyond the centrifuges themselves. But the deeper implication is not about centrifuges. It is about vulnerability. For over a decade, the Iranian regime has operated under the assumption that Fordow was untouchable, that the depth of the facility, the hardening of the structure, and the technical difficulty of executing a successful strike made it effectively immune to anything except a nuclear attack. That assumption shaped Iranian decision-making on the nuclear program. It shaped negotiating positions and diplomatic talks. It shaped the regime's confidence that even if surface facilities got destroyed, The core enrichment capability buried at Fordow would survive and could be used to restart the program after any conflict ended. The GBU-57 strike on Fordow broke that assumption. It demonstrated that the United States has the intelligence capability to map the internal geometry of deeply buried facilities, the weapons technology to reach targets at depths that Iranian engineers believed were safe, and the operational capability to deliver those weapons with precision against targets defended by whatever air defense capacity Iran has left after 2 weeks of suppression operations. That demonstration changes the calculation for every other hardened facility in Iran. Ballistic missile production plants buried in mountain complexes, command bunkers designed to shelter leadership during conflict, storage facilities for weapon systems that the regime has invested billions developing and protecting. Every installation that Iranian planners believed was protected by geology is now on the list of targets that American bunker busters can reach. And the list of facilities that Iran can credibly claim are too hard to strike just got much shorter. The timing of the Fordow strike also carries strategic messaging that goes beyond the immediate military effect. The 72-hour pause before the attack was deliberate. It allowed Iranian leadership to believe the campaign was over. It allowed regime messaging to shift toward narratives of survival and resilience. It allowed the population to start processing the idea that the worst had passed. And then CENTCOM struck the one facility that the regime had publicly and privately assured its supporters could never be successfully targeted. The psychological impact of that sequence is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Iranian leadership now faces a domestic audience that was told Fordow was safe and has just watched it get hit by weapons that penetrated defenses the regime claimed were impenetrable. Military commanders who built contingency plans around the assumption that certain facilities were too hardened to strike now have to recalculate every defensive posture based on the demonstrated capability of American bunker busters to reach targets at any depth. And regional adversaries watching this conflict are drawing their own conclusions about what happens when you build your strategic deterrents around facilities you believe cannot be touched, and then watch those facilities get destroyed anyway. The Iranian response in the days following the Fordow strike has been a mix of defiance and desperation. Official statements claim the nuclear program will continue, claims that enrichment capacity can be reconstituted, claims that the strike will not alter Iran's strategic trajectory. But behind the official rhetoric, there are signs of fracturing within the regime about what path forward is even available at this point. Hardline factions within the IRGC are pushing for continued resistance, arguing that capitulation after the Fordow strike would signal to adversaries that strikes on Iranian territory can produce concessions and inviting further escalation. Moderate voices within the political establishment are arguing that the military situation has deteriorated to the point where negotiation is the only path that preserves any remnant of the nuclear program and prevents further destruction of infrastructure that will take years and billions of dollars to rebuild. The tension between these positions is playing out in contradictory messaging from different parts of the Iranian government. Foreign ministry officials floating trial balloons about potential diplomatic frameworks, IRGC commanders issuing statements about continued military operations, the supreme leader maintaining public silence while the debate plays out among factions that all claim to speak for his authority. The pattern is consistent with a regime that does not have a unified position on how to respond to a situation that doctrine and planning never prepared them to face. Iran built Fordow to be untouchable. It positioned this facility as the insurance policy that guaranteed the nuclear program could survive any military pressure short of nuclear attack. And it used that assumed invulnerability as leverage in every negotiation about constraints on enrichment activity. CENTCOM just removed that leverage, not through diplomacy, not through sanctions, through a 30,000-pound bunker buster delivered by a stealth bomber that Iranian air defenses never detected until it was too late to matter. The final attack that Iran thought would never come just demonstrated that there is no facility too deep, no mountain too thick, and no installation too hardened to be beyond the reach of American conventional weapons when the decision is made to target it. That is not a temporary tactical setback that can be reconstituted during the next ceasefire. It is a permanent shift in the strategic balance that eliminates assumptions Iranian planning has relied on for over a decade. This is War Brief. Iran thought the strikes were over. 72 hours of silence reinforced that belief. And then CENTCOM launched one final attack on the facility Iran believed was untouchable. The centrifuge halls at Fordow are damaged. The assumption of invulnerability is shattered. And the regime is facing a choice between negotiating from a position weaker than anything it anticipated or continuing to fight a conflict where the capabilities it thought were protected are being eliminated one bunker buster at a time. So, if this breakdown gave you the strategic clarity you needed, subscribe to War Brief because the target list is not finished and the next phase of operations is already being coordinated. The question is not whether CENTCOM can reach any facility in Iran. The Fordow strike answered that. The question is, which facility gets hit next? I will see you in the next brief.